If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, aging.
So we came across a different podcast that also talks about the importance of squats, just like we have in our past podcasts. But this particular podcast, the hosts are Bob and Brad. They're kind of self-proclaimed physical therapists on the
Well, they're not self-proclaimed physical therapists. They're the self-proclaimed most famous physical therapist on the internet.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I wouldn't trust a physical therapist that was self-proclaimed. I would want to see that degree, that DPT after their name. But yeah, so we came across that video. It's actually titled Most Important Exercise for Seniors to Master. And obviously the most famous physical therapist on the internet, and hopefully maybe we aspire to be the most famous exercise physiologist on the internet.
That's right.
Like that's going to happen. But
not with that attitude.
True. But they do, it's a very good video, and we're not going to walk through all of it because I think every step of it is very good. They do have a lot of steps in there for increasing the necessary strength and functionality to be able to squat properly, which for a individual who has not exercised a lot or even a frail senior, so anybody looking to age well, having that progression in place to be able to be best prepared for doing the squat is going to be important. And so we'll link that particular podcast video in the description notes, and people can kind of go through that if they are a true beginner to the squat. But let's talk more about the importance of the squat for aging well.
I think a squat motion itself is something that each one of us does daily. You know, you go to sit down in a chair, you're performing a squat. You're standing up from the chair, you're using the same muscles that you resisted gravity going down. Now you're extending them and going upward. You have to pick something up off the ground. Well, best practice is to squat down and pick that up. Now, a lot of people would say, well, I just use a hinge, which is technically a deadlift style. Well, it kind of goes hand in glove with a squat.
Well, let's talk about picking things up from a hinge position.
Mm-hmm.
Again, most people do not hinge properly. And if they're picking up something heavy, what is the most appropriate mechanical process to pick that up? It's not bending at the hips and picking it up with your lower back, as most people tend to, when they hinge incorrectly, or using the lower back rather than the hamstrings, puts a lot of stress on the back, and that's why people have back issues. But if we squat down and do more of a deadlift, kind of lift off of the ground, we're using the glutes, the hamstrings, the quadriceps, and stabilizing with the back and the core in order to pick that up properly. So that is why I think it's important for aging well.
Yeah, well, speaking of aging well, it's also, if you really, really break down a squat, it's honestly, it's one of the first exercises that we've ever done. When a child is first learning how to walk, in order to get into that standing position, they kind of come from a squatted position. When they fall on their keister, they squat all the way down and they squat back up in order to get into that standing position. And somehow, the older we get, we just kind of slowly lose that range of motion from, that quote unquote ass to grass to a full standing erected position. And I think it's really interesting that we all started off doing a squat. We all started off with great form, and somehow that form kind of deteriorates over the years. But the importance of a squat starts with that foundation of when we were little.
Yeah. Well, if you look in certain cultures that are a bit more, I guess you say primitive than we are in our such advanced culture, and I put a little air quotes around that advanced culture, especially emphasis on the culture part, sarcastically, but also kind of a bit more literally. You look at those cultures, even their elderly maintain that more what they'd call like a primitive or a primal squat, where you're down in that more ass-to-grass position. Because when you're in that position, you have the stability to hold yourself. So they don't carry, their camping chairs around with them to sporting events or, chairs with them anywhere. They oftentimes don't sit in chairs all day like we do. And so they're able to maintain that range of motion. We tend to sit, and often very poorly, in very poorly designed chairs. And that contributes to some of our shortening of the muscles and some of the back issues that we tend to have as we age over time.
So where do you think that myth came from of don't squatting below 90 degrees?
That's a good question. And in many regards, I kind of blame my own profession, our own profession, the, exercise physiology professionals that tended to believe that it put added stress on the knee joint when we load in that position. But from a mechanical standpoint, it really absolutely makes no sense, because that's how the body is designed. It's designed to be able to move that load through a full range of motion. And so I think we became overly protected. We started teaching the squat incorrectly. And I remember learning and actually even teaching the squat where, as you sit down, the knees should not go over the toes, and you stay in a much more vertical position, and don't go down past parallel. And the reality is we have a bit more mobility, and we can have more mobility to be able to squat through a fuller range of motion. We can support that load through a fuller range of motion. And any injuries that are occurring as a result of squatting are not the fault of the squat itself. It's the fault of poor mechanics. And so if we overload the muscle, no matter how good our mechanics are, there's a risk of injury. If we underload the muscles, but do the movement incorrectly, there's a risk of injury. And more often than not, it's a combination of both. It's poor mechanics and people thinking they're a lot stronger than they are in the gym. And unfortunately, for a lot of the aging population who have become increasingly inactive and they attempt to get back into activity, they shy away from the squat because they're afraid that they might get injured.
So speaking of possible injuries or the basic mechanics or full range of motion, going back to Bob and Brad's podcast, they actually talk the basic, if you're kind of getting back into the swing of things and you're wanting to warm up the muscles before doing that squat motion, they actually kind of dive into doing a bridge activity first. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can spare our listeners too much time going into all the specifics of their kind of progressions, because they can kind of watch their video. But the whole point of kind of beginning with that bridge is learning to appropriately activate the gluteal muscles, which are going to be important at the hip hinge, but also being able to manage the forces that are going to be applied at the knees as well. And so when we look at anybody who has difficulty squatting, most commonly it's going to go back to the hips. And if the hips are weak, then that's going to transfer to weakness and instability at the knees. And typically and I've learned this kind of over time, when I get anybody starting doing the squat, one of the first things I want them to do is focus on activation of the gluteal muscles during the squat. And to do so, I tend to emphasize what's referred to as reactive neuromuscular training, which is just simply where you apply a force to the joint in the opposite direction of where you want it to go. And so when you wrap like a band around the hips, and there's some really good bands out there. I think on our list of the things that we wanted to add to our gym, I talked about the slingshot from Mark Bell. He also has and I forget exactly what they call the product, but it's again a pretty nice sturdy elastic band that wraps around the hips or just below the knees. You can put it at the ankles, above the knees. You can put it in multiple different spots, but it's just a loop of elastic material that has a pretty reasonable force to it, that as you squat with that, or you can use, TheraBand tied off or surgical tubing, rubber tubing, any kind of elastic resistance around the knees, or have somebody pull if it's like one particular knee or hip that's being affected. But generally starting to squat, having that wrapped around the knees as you squat down, if your hips are weak, what you're going to tend to see happen is that the knees are going to buckle as you move through the range of motion, meaning that the hips aren't contracting to keep the knees out. And so with the band around the leg, as you're squatting down, it's pulling you in. The natural reaction is to push out, which is what we want to do. And so it trains the brain to fire appropriate muscle mechanics in order to generate the force that's going to keep the hips out and strengthen the hips as we squat. And for a young athlete or a beginning athlete or beginner squatter, that's going to have a huge benefit in terms of reducing the risk of ACL tears in sport, but also give you better mechanics throughout the squat as you develop and start putting more weight on. I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging.
What about those individuals that have, they're not starting their journey. They maybe work at a job where they've been really stagnant, or they're not moving as often, and then they're wanting to get back into, exercise and fitness, and they want to age well, but they recognize the fact that their range of motion within the squat isn't where it needs to be or where it once was. I know Bob and Brad talk about the progression of the squats. Do we want to just kind of skim over a few pro tips and pointers real fast on those, just really quick on some progressions one might be able to do to further their range of motion in order to get into a good squat?
Well, I think there's a couple things to do. And again, I don't want to get too much into what they do in the video. I think in many regards too, they go into a little bit too much detail, and people might tend to spend almost too much time doing this. Their video is going to be much, much better for somebody who has significant immobility and, is much more inactive. But I think one of the first things to consider when attempting to master the squat is to actually just squat yourself down into that primal squat position. So you'll often hear, wide squat, narrow squat, feet under the shoulders, feet a little wider than shoulders. From a standpoint of where your feet should be placed and the angles that they should be placed, I feel the best thing to do is just kind of get down into that deepest squat position where you feel comfortable, you can get as deep as possible, and you could hold that position comfortably for at least several minutes. That's the position you want to be squatting down to. And so now if you can get up and down into that with your body weight, well, then you're pretty much ready to start adding some load to it. If you can't get through that full range of motion, then we need to build on that. And that might be, just simply for somebody who is very inactive, very weak, moving toward a chair target. Maybe squatting to a bench or a box, and you progressively move that box down to where they're getting through their full range of motion. You want to make sure that you're hip hinging properly. Now, with the mechanics of how far you are hinging, I tend not to give specifics to that because every body is different. If you have long legs, short torso, short legs, long torso, long legs, long torso, it's going to change your mechanics. And so the key is, without any added resistance, can you get through that full range of motion, squat down, come up without having to use your hands or any support? If you can do it with some level of support, like maybe holding a pole or something like that, then use that to help, again, build up the strength with body weight. And then, if there's certain areas where you're lacking mobility, then stretching and helping that is going to be of benefit. One thing that I like for giving better ankle mobility is, because of the nature of the ankle joint, if it's too tight, it won't flex, won't go into what's dorsiflexion, where your toes are coming up towards your knees, as effectively, because it just kind of locks the bones bind together. But if you can pull the bones of the lower leg forward, then that opens up that capsule and allows for greater flexion. And so what you might do is just simply wrap bands attached to a fixed object and squat down and allow those bands to kind of pull the joint forward, open up the joint, and allow you to increase that mobility a little bit. You just kind of sit down in there. I'll often use that as kind of a bit of a warm up. Just get down that deep position, rock around a little bit to kind of open up the ankle joints. That may be of benefit. Again, the key is going to be looking where your deficiencies are in your squat and trying to improve upon those in order to be able to properly perform the mechanics and then progress from there. So once you have the proper mechanics, full range of motion, then you start adding weight to it. And then the question is, how do we add the weight? Do we go right to a back squat? What's going to be kind of the best progression? And I actually think a good start for somebody who has never really lifted before and is attempting to master the mechanics of the squat, the goblet squat, is probably a pretty good starting point.
I would agree. Yep.
And then the challenge with the goblet squat, to me, is once you master it and you start loading it, how high can you go in the load in order to adequately overload the muscle? If you're really wanting to build strength, you have to add weight to it. You can't just continue to, grab a 20-pound kettlebell and do your goblet squats and just keep doing the same weight forever. Or if you're using a dumbbell, how big of a dumbbell can you actually hold in that position to adequately load it? For me, I guarantee there's not a dumbbell in the gym that is going to help me goblet squat. And so it becomes a useless exercise to me unless I'm really doing a lot of high repetitions with it, or going a very, very slow eccentric contraction, like we talked about in one of our recent podcasts about the importance of the eccentric load. But, if I go really, 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 really slow down, but that also doesn't necessarily develop my strength as much as hypertrophy. So to build strength, you want to go higher. So what do you think about progressing from there?
I would say progressing from there, I would say maybe switching it up to do a front squat and then adding the back squat. And I know a lot of people out there are like, no, you got to do back squat first and then front squat. I actually would disagree. I think going from goblet to a front squat, because you're still having somewhat of the same mechanics, you're adding a lot more weight and you're not throwing your form off that much, right? And then progressing from that front squat to the back squat. Now, there's a huge argument out there. Do you go high bar or low bar for back squat? Me, just because I have a freakishly long torso and actually really short legs, I like low bar personally. I feel that I can load up a lot more weight on a low bar squat and I get a full range of motion doing it that way.
I am not a fan of the front squat.
Really? Okay.
Because it is hard on the wrists. It's a little bit harder to kind of hold and to stabilize. So for a lot of people, it may be a bit more intimidating. The load tends to be a lot lighter. I can't really ever go that high. So I have become much more a fan of the Zercher squat, which is, very close cousin, I think, to the goblet squat. The difference is that rather than holding a weight at your chest, you're holding the barbell in the crux of the arm. And that can be challenging for some because there's a little bit of pain threshold to kind of overcome there. But if you use a little bit of padding, I prefer to use just neoprene sleeves on my elbows, and that seems to protect them well enough. But I found that I could probably Zercher squat more than double, well, maybe not quite double what I can do in a front squat. And it is less stressful even on my back. I can go really deep. I feel it a lot safer because if I do get stuck in the bottom, it's very easy to just kind of drop the weight to the front of me and not cause any harm. And so I find it to be a very, very good exercise that we're probably going to see it become much more popularized. It's a relatively new exercise to a lot of people, but as I have introduced it to athletes, they love it. As I've kind of talked with other strength and conditioning coaches, they're starting to incorporate a little bit more into their training. And it's just a really great exercise. And part of the reason why I prefer it even over the back squat is that it not only strengthens the lower back like you get with the back squat, but the core itself has to be much more engaged in order to stabilize that weight. It requires more upper back, middle back to be able to stabilize the weight. You get some bicep work out of it. It hits the quadriceps as well as the glutes and the hamstrings extremely well, which means also going down deep, you're going to get the quads in there. Because you have to go out a little bit wider, you get a better mechanic in squatting down, because in order to get deep enough for your elbows to go kind of between your legs, you got to spread the legs out a little bit, which means it engages the hips a bit more, also engages the adductor muscles, I feel, a lot more than even the squat does. And so I think that is a very, very good underutilized exercise for aging well.
I will agree with you. I just think, and this is just my opinion, I think a Zercher squat would be the next step after a back squat for me. So if I had to do that progression, I think it would be goblet, front, back, and then into that Zercher. And the only reason why is because I feel that when your hands are out, I feel like your shoulders kind of curl a little bit. And then that kind of,
that's improper mechanics. Again,
but I feel
you want to be in a position where you're stabilizing with that upper back. And then there might be a little bit of rolling of the shoulders, but it's rolling in a more effective position. You think of like with strongmen when they lift those Atlas stones.
That's true.
The round balls, they have to kind of arch round the back a little bit more, but it is a more proper, when you're hunching over like that, it's not like hunching over in a deadlift where people tend to, round the back and, maybe put a little bit of more stress on the back. That rounding is more involving a protraction of the scapula and a kind of a proper scapular rhythm in the movement that is a bit more athletic. I think it's a bit more functional, and the technique is going to be appropriate for how you have to hold that bar. And think of the number of times we carry something kind of in front of us, that's going to help us as well. And so the Zercher squat to me is a little bit better than going with the back squat, because the back squat for me, I find it a little bit more stressful on my back. Although when I do properly squat and, manage the weight properly, it actually makes my back feel a little bit better. But there's negatives to the back squat. It's if it's on my back and I get stuck at the bottom, where's the bar got to go? It's got to have to roll over my fingers in order to drop it from behind, or I'm folding forward and hopefully having my safety bars in place to be able to catch myself. Whereas with the Zercher squat, I can squat with the safety bars appropriately positioned, and then it's just a couple inch drop, which is really easy, even better than the squat, or I can just simply drop it all the way to the floor. And so I find it safer. I just find it much more effective in terms of the engagement of all the muscles. You don't engage the back in quite the same way that you do with the Zercher squat. And then regarding like high versus low bar squat, again, there's some mechanical differences with that, but unless you are a power lifter and you're looking at what is going to allow you to lift the greatest amount of weight, and again with powerlifting, it's you only have to go down to that 90 degrees, so you have to kind of break parallel and then you're good. So it's not to your benefit to go a full ass to grass kind of squat. Then, low bar might be a little bit more effective for lifting the heavy weights. High bar tends to be favored for some in terms of hypertrophy. But for me, I have like one position on my back where the bar really feels comfortable because I have a rather large protruding spinal process of the seventh vertebra. And that's normally where that bar might hit in a high bar. Feels very uncomfortable. And low bar seems a little too low. There's just a natural position right my trapezius that it just holds the bar well. So I would encourage people not worry about high bar, low bar, foot position, any of that kind of stuff. Just find what is the most comfortable where you can support the weight, go as deep as possible, full range of motion, and then progress from there.
I would agree with that.
And then it allows us to, kind of talk a little bit about like the 5x5 that we've talked about in the past. I mean, that heavily involves the squat, but it basically just starts with a 45-pound weight or barbell on your back. Really it could be whatever the lightest load is that you can squat, and then you just keep progressively increasing that. Once you can do 5 sets of 5, and once you get to the point where you start to plateau, then we can start to talk about different techniques for managing the load in the squat. But I think at this point, we're really just talking about the importance of the squat. And most of our listeners are never going to get to that point where we have to really get into the nuances of training the squat, hypertrophy, strength, explosiveness, and all that kind of stuff. That's more sport specific. But
what if an individual has mastered the squat, and what if they're like, okay, I'm ready to take my leg exercises to the next routine, and they go online and they come across this article that says, stop squatting now. There's 4 leg exercises that are better for leg muscle gains. And then in parentheses, opinion, meaning this is just an opinion. And so because of that, we are going to give our opinion on this
opinion
article. Yeah.
Yes. When I came across that, and that was, shortly after we started kind of discussing this topic, what we're going to cover in this particular episode, I came across this, and it's like, here we are telling people start squatting. Squatting is one of the most important exercises you can do. And then somebody comes along with their opinion saying, stop squatting now. These exercises are better for leg muscle gains. Now, I think one important caveat to this is that the focus is much more on bodybuilding and just increasing sheer aesthetics of the leg, which...
who doesn't want that?
Yeah. But I think, and as the literature supports, the most important thing when it comes to aging well is building strength, not necessarily muscular size. Some of that muscular size may be completely useless size. It might look good, but it's not going to do much for you. So let's just kind of go through each of these exercises that we should be doing instead of squatting, according to the author's opinion. What's the first one?
The first one is actually leg exercises that are better, falls into dumbbell Bulgarian split squats.
Now, I do love the Bulgarian split squat. Whether you're using dumbbells or barbell, it's a great exercise. But if you are learning the movement and you're not dealing with a lot of strength, it's much more difficult to go from bilateral to unilateral type of exercises. So you're elevating the level of difficulty in the exercise. And if you can't do a proper squat and do a properly loaded squat, then moving directly to a Bulgarian split squat, you're more likely to have some poor mechanics there. You're not going to load it as adequately. You're not going to get the best benefit out of it. So this is a progression and a variant to the normal barbell squat, that once you've mastered it and you need some variety in your exercise, start doing that. But I would still not completely dismiss the squat for the Bulgarian split squat. And I love the image in the article as I'm looking at it right now. Is this woman is in her dumbbell squat position. She has one weight on there. It's a relatively light weight, and she's looking sideways in the mirror. It's like anytime you're looking sideways, you're starting to put a little bit of trunk rotation into your movement, and it's like, oh my, if you got to look at yourself in the mirror, at least look forward into the mirror so you can actually do the mechanics properly. But that's just a pet peeve.
Yeah, she's watching her form.
Yeah, she's checking herself out, looking at her shoulder tattoo and her mask. Number two, dumbbell walking lunges, superset with hands over the head walking lunges. What do you think of that?
I think you got to master the squat before you start going into lunges. I think you need to be really in tune with your body. Based off of my personal experience, I feel that there are a lot of individuals out there that don't know how to properly lunge. They either lunge like way too fast because they're like, I just want to get this over with. And they're not actually getting the actual full range of motion or the exercise in, or they lunge in the mindset that they've lunged in the past. Maybe they've taken a Pilates or a yoga class and they're putting that knee way too far ahead of the actual foot. And then I have seen knee injuries going that way. Instead of what they should be doing is taking a wider step and then just bringing that back knee down. That way they are engaging both the hamstrings, the quads, and the glutes. And then as they come up, they're just stepping right where they need to. But people are just, I want to get this exercise over with. And instead of focusing on actual form, technique, engagement of the muscles, what muscles are they actually firing? I think going back to the basics of doing the squats first and being aware of the body before taking the same lunges in a moving direction, I think getting that the mastering of the actual body mechanics down is going to be way more critical before diving into an actual movement pattern.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I also have issues with the whole idea of a superset of these walking lunges. I mean, first of all, you're taking a less complex movement first and then putting the complex movement afterwards, where you're holding the hands over the head while walking. That's engaging the core a lot more. It's causing a lot more instability, which means you're going to be less likely to be moving in the proper lunging position. And so putting those in a superset just seems rather stupid to me. But I do think that as a progression, eventually that might be worthwhile. But I also think that before you are doing any kind of dumbbell walking lunges or hands over the head walking lunges, you should be also mastering the carries, so doing farmer carries, and whether that is holding dumbbells at the side, doing more of a briefcase carry, or hands over the head. There's a lot of variety that you can do with those that are going to help to strengthen the core. I think master the squat first, the more stable position, go to the Bulgarian squat next, before really progressing to lunges, and then going to lunges for a little bit more instability, a little bit more maybe explosiveness in the legs. And then maybe if you really need that much more variety and to get, if you want to call it a more functional movement, which I don't necessarily agree with the phrase, I would say then you could go into using either of these two movements. I wouldn't really combine the two. I might look at, doing a over the head walking lunge once you've kind of mastered the walking lunge, and then follow that up with, say, a squatting movement or something like that to be able to kind of further engage the muscles and further develop strength. But again, for many of our listeners who are looking at simplifying time in the gym, we don't want to be adding a lot of layering of exercises. We want to keep it simple, keep it productive. And there's nothing more productive than just doing a proper weighted squat. and hip hinge exercise in order to really kind of blast the muscles of the legs and the whole body.
I do understand somewhat of the thought process of having the weight above, up in the air and overhead, because every time we're lifting that weight above the head or keeping the arms above the head, we are accelerating the heart rate a lot more. So I understand the thought process there of, oh, you got to get your exercise in. You only have a short amount of time. Let's spike it is. But again, going back to the squat where you're engaging so much more, you had mentioned earlier, even in this podcast, you're not just engaging the quads, the hamstrings, and the glutes. We're also engaging the hip joints, the knee joints, the ankle joints. You're engaging your core, both your abdominal and your whole back that stabilizes you. And then if you throw in that Zercher, you're throwing in the biceps, the shoulders, everything. And so if you really want like a quick exercise in, like, I really don't think there's anything that's beating squats, especially if you're lifting heavy.
And you mentioned heart rate, getting your heart rate up. We have to remember the principle of specificity. If we're trying to build strength, we want to be doing strength exercise. If you're getting the heart rate up, it's counterproductive to building strength. We want to use the heart rate elevation for more cardiorespiratory endurance type of training. So if that is your goal and you're maybe looking at putting together a high intensity interval resistance training or just simply high intensity interval training session in order to burn fat and to have a modest effect on your cardiorespiratory and a modest effect on strength gains, then maybe combining these two exercises with a modest amount of weight that is really where you can do it in the best controlled form, but do enough repetitions, you're getting the heart rate up and you're burning calories, then I would go with that. But from a strength standpoint and a hypertrophy standpoint, I would shy away from an exercise like the walking lunge for most people. What is number 3?
Number 3, leg exercises that are better than squats is the dumbbell sumo squat. That's interesting.
Yeah. The dumbbell sumo squat. And again, a decent exercise. I don't see how any kind of dumbbell squat benefits you once you get strong enough to be able to utilize the barbell. If you really want to do sumo squats, then pull up a loaded barbell. If you're progressing those weights and you're just kind of starting out, then you can maybe try a sumo squat. Is it better than doing a squat? Not really. Again, I would say doing the Zercher squat is going to be a bit more effective overall than doing a dumbbell sumo squat. What do you think?
I'm not the biggest fan of sumo squats personally. I do see a lot of their benefits as far as your abductors and adductors. I definitely, the inner thigh, and I can see the argument if someone has more hip flexibilities with their toes pointed out, so they feel that they can get a better range of motion. I can see the argument there, but I don't know. I don't feel with so with the sumo squat, your legs are spread out a lot wider, even though your toes are out. It's kind of irrelevant if you're going out super, super wide. Personally, I don't think you can get full range of motion when you're that wide, no matter how many people can argue against it. I mean, you just look even at the professionals that do a sumo style deadlift in a deadlift competition. They're really not getting as great of a range of motion as someone that's doing a standard one. But that's just my opinion, arguing against someone else's opinion.
Yeah. And, the fact that this opinion is supposed to be stop squatting, and then you say, but do a sumo squat.
Do a sumo squat.
You're still squatting. I think rather than doing sumo squats, focus like maybe sumo deadlift if that works well for you. But sumo squats, I say squat in your natural body mechanics, because if you try forcing your feet out too wide, you're likely to develop a little bit more hip problems. And while they say that dumbbell sumo squats are an alternative if you're experiencing lower back issues or recovering from an injury, yes, they might because you're not loading the spine, but you're also putting your body in a different position to rather than, as your back issues resolve themselves, you start developing hip issues or other issues. So kind of be careful in why you do what you do and, is it going to be really beneficial for you? And I'm just not a huge fan of sumo squatting. Some people like a wider squat. That's great if that works for you, if that's in your mechanics. They also say in this article that if you can choose to perform it with an elevated heel if you find ankle mobility an issue. Well, elevating the heel doesn't correct the ankle mobility issue. It just allows you to compensate for it. And I would argue, let's focus on resolving the ankle mobility issue and then add some weight to it. So yeah, I don't really agree with number 3. And I don't feel like, we're really making an argument that a different squat is better than the squat. So let's go to number 4.
Number 4. Leg exercise that's better than a squat is the leg extension superset with a dumbbell Romanian deadlift. Yeah. Leg extension superset with okay. All right.
So essentially what they're saying is you do your leg extensions on a machine and then you go right to RDLs. And, why can't you superset the squat with the Romanian deadlift? And why is it going to be dumbbells? I love the RDL. That's my favorite hip hinge exercise, even more so than a squat, because I think it's a little bit better for hypertrophy because it's a little bit better to load heavy than really doing high reps with a normal, more traditional deadlift. So I love the RDL for the hamstrings. Great exercise. Dumbbells if you want to use them. But again, as your load progresses, it's going to be harder and harder to either find a dumbbell size that you need or to really hold the dumbbells. If you want to go heavy and you want more of a parallel grip on either side, then I'd say use a hex bar, and then you can really load it heavy. I love those. And I could go, I'm pushing closer to almost 400 pounds on an RDL with a hex bar, and I love it. Really feel the proper strain in my hamstrings and get a lot of benefit out of it. What are your thoughts on leg extensions?
I don't agree with them. I don't agree with a lot of machine movement. I think free weights is more of the way to go. I feel like with free weights, that's more natural. It's what our body is designed to do. Our body is not designed to go into the wilderness and say, oh my gosh, there's a machine that's perfectly stabilizing and static, and I'm just going to put my feet under and extend my legs all the way up. I think squatting, lunges, deadlifts, anything that involves a free weight style where you're resisting gravity, not resisting the resistance of the actual machine, which is stationary. And on top of that, machines are all different. They really are. You can put 75 pounds and do an extension on one machine and then go to the next machine and put in that 75 pounds. And for some reason, it feels like 175 pounds. There's no actual, there's no standard for the machine.
That's not that important because you just have to recognize that, it might not feel like you're doing the same amount of weight, but you really are, because it's not the weight number on the stack. It's the actual resistance that is applied to the muscle. So it's actually the force generation within the muscle that causes the muscle to grow. And so the numbers are not important. Some machines are a little bit better than others. I think the issue with the leg extension is that it is an isolation exercise, and it takes more time. If you want to look at opportunity costs, if you're going to isolate each muscle, and you got to do like leg extensions. And then of course, now you have to do 2 exercises here for the legs to hit the quadriceps. You have to do the leg extensions. To do the hamstrings, you're doing the RDL. In a squat, you can kind of hit all those muscles much more effectively. So I'm not a fan of doing leg extensions except for bodybuilding purposes for more aesthetics.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think if you're isolating the muscles just to get that blood flow in and your goal is to be a bodybuilder and to look good, yeah, aesthetically, yes. But that's not what we were talking about. We're talking about aging well and building strength.
And, to do leg extensions instead of squats really kind of misses the point. There's not a weakness in the squat that is compensated for by doing leg extensions. All you're doing is taking an exercise that is generating force in numerous muscle groups. I mean, we talk about the Zercher, from upper back, through the core, to the hips, to the quads, the hamstrings, the calf muscles, even, posterior anterior calf muscles for stabilization. You're hitting a boatload of muscles in there doing one exercise, one movement. Leg extension, now you have to do several more exercises in order to accomplish that, which means that you're spending more time at the gym, or because you're doing less, you're going to get less benefit out of the exercise. So let's be time efficient. Let's do the squat, do it properly, and do the variance that, gives us some variability in our exercise, but it's going to give us the most bang for our buck.
I also just feel like, comparatively speaking, like leg extensions versus a squat or a deadlift, I just feel that, like, why would you want to do something that's obsolete? I just feel like it is comparatively comparing the two exercises, more bang for your buck, more muscles that are engaged, more strength that you can add on to, more everything. I just feel that it's just obsolete unless you're trying to do it for the aesthetics.
Yeah, again, it's not obsolete for the bodybuilder. I mean, the bodybuilder is going to need that leg extension machine. They're going to benefit a lot more from using more isolation exercises, machines where they can really extensively fatigue and overload the muscle properly. But for the average person who is looking to build strength and not necessarily worried about the symmetry of that strength, because when you're contracting you're extending the leg by contracting the quadricep muscles. You're contracting the quadricep muscles. There's not a huge difference in how those muscles contract to do a leg extension in a squat versus in a leg extension. Now, there's a bit of nuance in terms of the amount of load based on how the barbell is positioned, and that gets into a lot of mechanics and lever lengths and all that kind of stuff. And you can argue till you're blue in the face which is better for certain situations. But overall, we're just looking to get stronger, and we want to do it as simply and as effectively as possible to be able to age well. So,
nailed it.
So any summary for today's podcast?
I think the summary for today's podcast is pretty simple. Squats are something that we've done since the moment we first started walking. We've talked about the benefits of squats throughout several of our other podcasts. It's either a part of that 5x5 program or that special 7 program that we've also discussed. We've talked about the different varieties of squats, anywhere between the goblets, the Zercher, the front, the back, whatever you decide that you're going to use at a part of your squat routine, it's going to be beneficial regardless. You just have to work what's best for you and your body mechanics. And then don't believe everything that you read online. Some things may seem appetizing because, squats are difficult. Squats are challenging, but they're so beneficial. And someone once told me that anything worth a challenge or anything worth fighting for, the reward in the end is so much more beneficial. So why not just give yourself that benefit, take on this challenge, get back to the basics of what you first started doing as a young child, and carry that forward through the rest of your life in order to have you age well.
Sounds good. And if you don't believe us, you can take the advice of the most famous physical therapist on the internet, Bob and Brad, and kind of watch their video and learn a little bit more of some of the other techniques that you can use to prepare yourself to squat to age well. Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.